Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Bruce Young, Chief Scientist at NatureServe, and I'll kick things off here. First, I want to introduce my USGS collaborators on the CCVI project, who will be presenters in today's webinar. So Lindsay Thurman works out of the Northwest Climate Adaptation Center. John Stevenson is at the Wyoming-Montana Water Science Center. And Marta Lyons is at the Midwest CASC. And so the way the agenda works today is I'm going to start by saying a few words about NatureServe for the couple of people in the audience who might not know about us. And then Lindsay will introduce the CASCs and then describe the work that went into release 4.0. Then John will walk us through actually using the new online tool. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about the new Excel version of the CCVI. So just very quickly about NatureServe. NatureServe works as a network of about 16 state natural heritage programs, distributed mostly one per state or province and territory in Canada. NatureServe provides a biodiversity database, a taxonomic backbone for species and ecosystems, and assesses the conservation status of these species and ecosystems. The heritage programs perform surveys on the ground to identify the locations of populations of rare and endangered species and rare ecosystems. Together, upwards of 1,000 conservation professionals constitute this network. So we're talking about the Climate Change Vulnerability Index for Species, but as some of you know, NatureServe has also developed a methodology for assessing the climate change vulnerability of habitats, or something we call the HCCVI, or the Climate Change Vulnerability Index for Ecosystems. So that's, I'm picturing here. There's a link to where you can learn more about it. I'll paste that link in the chat as soon as I stop talking here. And I'll also put in the name of Patrick McIntyre, who's the person to get in touch with if you're interested in that. So next slide, and Lindsay, take it over.
Yeah, so because this is a highly collaborative effort, we wanted to also introduce you to the Climate Adaptation Science Centers in case you are unfamiliar. We have 9 regional and national climate adaptation science centers. And these are essentially federal university, or sorry, I should say federal and consortium partners. We have several non-university consortium members these days, including others from DOI bureaus, state agencies, NGOs, as well as some indigenous communities. And we work together to basically provide early career training, capacity building, and science to inform climate adaptation action. And so we really try and harness the sort of diverse expertise of all of our partners and provide the best available science. So please check us out if you're unfamiliar. We have a CASC in your region ready to help. So we wanted to also discuss the intended purpose for the CCVI, the Climate Change Vulnerability Index. This is pretty consistent from the previous release, but we wanted to discuss what the CCVI does and why people use it. Essentially, the CCVI is a tool for assessing the relative vulnerability of species to climate change within a given geographical area. And it's applicable to virtually any taxa, wildlife, fish, plants, invertebrates. And it allows users to identify species that are in most urgent need of management action, as well as identify sort of how climate change is affecting those target species and why it's affecting them. And this helps to inform adaptation planning. It can help you to get a broader understanding of potential climate impacts. And it's also a useful tool for identifying information gaps and science needs. And many of our users have used it in the past and are currently using it to inform their state wildlife action plans and their species of greatest conservation need. This figure here is just an excerpt from a report done in Michigan for the 2015 SWAP, where they used CCVI to evaluate the relative climate vulnerability of their SGCN. And you can see here it was an effort to sort of get a relative understanding of the vulnerability across all their priority species. And so we use the traditional three-part vulnerability assessment framework as the underlying structure for the CCVI. The traditional framework includes exposure, adaptive capacity, and sensitivity. Exposure being the rate and magnitude of climatic changes experienced by a species, when combined with sensitivity, which is sort of the degree of susceptibility to those impacts that informs the potential impact of climate change on the species. And then adaptive capacity is thought of as this sort of mediating component, and it is the ability of the species to cope with or adjust to those changing conditions. And together, those are integrated into a vulnerability assessment. The previous release of the CCVI, for those of you that are familiar, is an Excel workbook, and it comes with guidelines and instructions for completing it. Conveniently, we've retained an Excel workbook format for this latest release, in addition to the online tool that we will show you later. But this structure and format of the Excel workbook version is relatively similar for those of you that are familiar with the previous release of CCVI. And the underlying algorithm for the earlier release of CCVI followed a fairly straightforward flow of information from inputs on climate change exposure and a whole suite of biological factors related to species sensitivity and adaptive capacity. There's also an option to include information from the literature to inform this documented or observed responses component, which can separately and is an optional way of integrating sort of evidence-based information as well. And you get a nice categorical score of vulnerability with a measure of confidence. And we haven't tweaked this algorithm a whole lot. We've added a lot of additional factors and updated certain aspects of the modules within the tool. And so in a second, we'll go through that in more detail. I also wanted to give a nod to the states that have already used CCVI back in 2015, just to sort of showcase that it is widely used, and to also acknowledge that our state partners are one of our primary audiences for this newest release, as we've been really trying to help roll out this new tool to meet their 2025 SWAP revision deadlines. Back in 2015, we had several states that used the CCVI to evaluate climate change vulnerability for their species. Some went so far as to use it to help rank and prioritize SGCN, and we expect many will be doing something similar for this round. So what has gone into the updates for this new CCVI 4.0 release? Sort of three key aspects of the update that we want to walk through. The first being the development of this online tool. It's a web-based platform with the main goal of facilitating collaboration and data sharing among users. So there's a new load, save, and share function that allows you to save progress on assessments and share them with collaborators. And we will do a demonstration of the online tool shortly. Another key area of update for the CCVI 4.0 is an update to the climate exposure data. I should note that we have sort of two phases to this project. This is all a part of the phase 1 CCVI 4.0 release. And in this release, we have updated the climate exposure data, which I'll describe in a second, but we're still only retaining two metrics, one for temperature and one for climatic water deficit. For now. Phase 2 will be a deeper dive into additional climate change exposure variables to capture more biological relevance with respect to the species sensitivities. The third key update is the integration of adaptive capacity metrics, and this comes from the Adaptive Capacity Assessment Framework published back in 2020. And about the climate data, we're using mid-century projections, so that is 2040 to 2069. As I mentioned, we're still only looking at temperature, and now we're using climatic water deficit instead of the earlier version was another moisture metric. And in this release, we're using a multi-model mean of 20 downscaled models from the MACA version 2 downscaling data. And we are now providing both RCP 4.5 and 8.5 emission scenarios to help get at that range of uncertainty into the future. And this means you will now have 2 vulnerability scores reported at the end of your assessment, one for 4.5 and one for 8.5. For the exposure data itself, we've rescaled it to look at delta values. So that is the delta mean change in those conditions from the historical baseline to mid-century. And all of this is detailed in our guidance document, which we've published and is available on the NatureServe website if you'd like to dive into the specifics in more detail. And one of the really cool things that we'll demonstrate with the online tool is that we now allow the user a GIS web-based interface to specify the spatial extent of your vulnerability assessment, which directly influences that exposure calculation. So you can upload a shape file, so like a range map of your species. You could just draw or edit a polygon on the online tool. Or if you're doing, say, hundreds of species for your swap, you can just focus in on a drop-down menu of states. And for those unfamiliar with the adaptive capacity framework, this is a tool that we put out a couple of years ago to help operationalize this concept of adaptive capacity for our practitioners. It includes, at this point now, 37 factors. We added a new one for this CCVI 4.0 release that relates to species disturbance tolerances. But the factors in the assessment framework are organized into 7 different modules, and that term modules will come up a lot when we do the demonstration of the online tool. And just like the previous sensitivity factors in CCVI 3.0, they all have, each factor has their own set of criteria for determining, low to high adaptive capacity. And if you want more information about this framework in particular, which is also a standalone tool, you can access the Thurman et al. Paper down here, as well as the Lynch et al. CCVI 4.0 document. And a little bit under the hood here, we do have a full detailed diagram of the underlying vulnerability algorithm in our document, our guidance document, and it will also be published in a peer-reviewed journal. But this is sort of a high-level overview, just kind of showing how these pieces of the puzzle come together. As I mentioned, we have our 2 exposure scores for RCP 4.5 and 8.5. We have a module that for now only encompasses sea level rise, but we hope to include additional what we're calling indirect exposure factors. We have all the new adaptive capacity / sensitivity modules, and this what we call threat multipliers module, which brings in information on other anthropogenic related threats or biological threats that could help kind of constrain the species' adaptive capacity and influence their vulnerability. And like the previous release, we also have this optional module on observed responses if you want to leverage information from the literature to inform the assessment. And as I mentioned, feel free to access the guidelines online if you want to take a deeper dive into the algorithm. And Bruce will have a few minutes at the end to show you the Excel workbook. If you'd like to take a look at that option for exploring the assessment as opposed to the online tool. Many have opted to use the online tool to extract that those exposure scores based on the GIS interface. And then you can just directly input that into the Excel workbook if you choose to use the Excel workbook. And there's a couple other features available in the Excel workbook that are not yet available in the online tool that Bruce will share as well. And as I mentioned earlier, we are doing this in sort of 2 phases. First phase was working towards some of the more pressing and immediate needs to update the tool, like I said, primarily for our swap partners. or swap, folks working on swaps. Phase 2, which we're currently in the early stages of, is an investigation into additional climate variables that could be included and looking at the sensitivity of the algorithm to additional inputs, such as those seasonal or extreme climate conditions. And so we will have some sort of iterative development with our technical advisory committee over the next year. And eventually we'll roll out a second CCVI release. We're not sure how to frame this yet, but it's going to be sort of like if you think of the NatureServe Explorer Pro, it's kind of like that for the CCVI. So this current release of CCVI 4.0 will remain into the future. And the CCVI 4.0 Pro, if you will sort of be like an advanced assessment tool for those interested. And before we dive into questions and the demonstration of the online tool, I want to give a very sincere thank you to our technical advisory committee members who have been working with us over the last year plus to provide input into the features of the tool and do some beta testing. And they've been really integral to all of the products we're showing today. And I think I will turn it over to you all for questions if you have them.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. Great overview. So far, there have been no questions that came into the Q&A box. Okay, so we got one question.
Yeah.
Want to get that, Lindsay?
Yeah, so we're not exactly sure what the uncertainty assessment piece of the CCVI will look like. Most likely for now, we're going to explore ways to sort of qualitatively score the strength of evidence for factors. I know in previous CCVI, maybe Bruce can speak to this better, they did, I think it was like a Monte Carlo simulation of evidence that gave like a more quantitative evaluation of certainty. So I think there will be some ways to explore that for this next CCVI release, but we haven't quite nailed that down yet.
And certainly if you have suggestions, let us know. All right, good question. Oh, we got one more.
I think this is a good question for you, Bruce, maybe on the Canadian version.
Yeah, so is the Canadian version of the CCVI the same and the one south, I think that means as the one south of the border, can you do cross-border assessments? So great question. Currently, if you go to the website, there is a Canadian version of the CCVI. This is now several years old. The current funding allowed us just to update the US version. The climate data are just available for the US. However, there's considerable interest on the part of NatureServe Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada to have a Canadian version. So that that could certainly be something that happens in the future. I should also point out that I was just made aware that there's an R package now for the existing Canadian version of the CCVI that in a minute I can post a link to that. So that's where we are with Canada. And if there's any Canadians on the call that have more to add, just please write what you can share in the chat. Great questions. Let's move on though and hear John give us a walkthrough of the online version.
Great. Well, thanks for joining, everybody. My name is John Stevenson, and I'm going to give you a walkthrough, kind of well, I'll call this a brief overview of the tool for the online release. I'm going to really be focusing in on function and some key areas to kind of draw your attention where people might get hung up rather than the specific content or the details of the actual assessment criteria. So when you go to the website, and the links have been available, I think, on Lindsay's website, but also on the NatureServe CCVI main site, you'll be taken to this page. And before we get into this kind of this overview form, I just want to draw your attention to just kind of the format. So up here, you'll see in the right-hand corner, my email address. That indicates that I've been logged in. If you are not logged in, this is replaced with a login link. And if you have not created an account already, when that little login window pops up, there is a little, I think it's a sign up link to actually create an account. So that really is your first step once you get here. Secondarily, this first page is one of, excuse me, I believe 12 kind of tabs that provide an overview, or excuse me, that are part of the assessment. So this first one really is just about capturing major information about the assessment. So things like geographic area assessed, and you'll note that is in red and is asterisk. That indicates that it is required to be filled out. These gray fields are optional. And then so you have the things like assessor, species name, species common name, any population or distinct components of the species or population you're looking at, kingdom drop-down and taxonomic drop-downs, along with the conservation ranks from NatureServe's global and sub-regional conservation ranks. And then lastly, there's this assessment notes. Even though these gray areas are not required, we really highly recommend that you do populate them. It's difficult to really know who's going to be looking at this into the future. So this is a great place to capture things like who all was involved in the assessment, perhaps what it was for, or things like information sources relied on. So this is kind of your catch-all. So this is a blank form. For demonstration purposes, I did go ahead and create kind of a demo assessment. And so I'm going to load that up here at this top banner on this load button. I'm just going to click load. And it's thinking. And so now you can see that I have 2 records. And then just to point out those information fields from that first assessment page are now all recorded here in the columns function. And so again, distinguishing information about each assessment is pretty important, particularly in this case. I have 2 records for the same species, in this case, Castor canadensis or the American beaver, just to help you to distinguish what you're looking for. So I'm going to click this box next to the record that I want to load, and then I'm going to go down to this load button and click on it. And so now we're back to that same initial tab, but in this case now it is populated with the species and the population I'm looking at. In this case, the Northern Oregon Coast Range, my name, the scientific name for American beaver, the population or their designation. This comes from some work where we're real interested in where beavers are building dams in streams that are populated by juvenile coho salmon, which are listed as threatened in that particular area. And then as well some of these other things. Okay, so that's kind of your opening component. I will note you can also save up here, and we do recommend that you do that fairly frequently as you move through these assessments. So I'm going to advance to the next tab. This is the first real kind of information you put in. This is calculating, or where you calculate the exposure for your spatial extent of interest. So that could be your species range or not. There are really 3 ways to identify geography, but the important thing here is that you're really defining what is the area that we need to average those exposure estimates that we have for all of the continental United States that Lindsay walked us through earlier. So the first here, I have the state of Oregon outlined, and I'll kind of show you that and the 2 other options for spatial extent. But before I do that, I just want to draw your attention. So when you do define a spatial area, you get this exposure estimate down here. And as Lindsay noted, we scaled this exposure from 0 to 1. And then we provide that for each of those emission scenarios that she discussed earlier. So RCP 8.5, which is a relatively high emission rate of emissions, and RCP 4.5, which is more of a moderate. And so these are the estimated scores from 0 to 1 for each of those 2 respective scenarios. Okay, and that again is for the entire state of Oregon. So that is the first way, and I simply selected the state by using this drop down, scrolling down to Oregon, clicking on it, and then this popped up. I will note you can also click on this shape, and you can edit the vertices if you wanted to. So before I show you the second one, now that it's highlighted, I'm going to go ahead and delete it so we can do something different. And I'm going to draw your attention now to these exposure estimates have these little orange triangles. And that is basically telling you that these numbers are no longer valid because the spatial extent has changed. All right, so number 2 option is just to simply draw a polygon. And so I'm going to do that by draw polygon button. And now I have a little cross on my mouse, and I'm just going to start clicking areas that perhaps we're interested in for these population of beavers overlapping with juvenile coho salmon. And I'm just going to double click to close it out. I can click on that shape and edit it if I want. I can also draw additional shapes. So I can kind of come down here and look at maybe the southern extent of coho. We'll just call it that. A little bit crude, but I think everybody gets the idea. And again, my orange bars are still there. And now I'm going to hit the calculate button, which has now been illuminated. And now the tool is going to think and recalculate the average exposure for each of those 2 scenarios across both areas. So it averages across, in this case, the 2 shapes. And so now we have our new exposure estimates. So that's option 2 for defining spatial extent. The second option, or sorry, the third option is to click this upload shapefile button here. And once you do that, it opens up your directory and you can go ahead and select your file. A couple of things to be aware of when using a shapefile. First is that you do have to upload that as a compressed zip file. So that is the requirement. And then second, we did notice that there are some computational limits of the tool for really complicated shapes. And so we ran into this when we were trying to upload the shapefile for the state of Florida, which has some very complex coastlines. And ultimately, there were too many vertices in that shapefile, and the tool produced an error. The way we resolved that was just to create a more simplified coastline with fewer vertices, and then re-upload that shapefile. So that's something to be aware of if you do run into this problem. Okay, so that is exposure. I'm going to go ahead and now that we no longer have these error, excuse me, the orange error triangles, we can go ahead and advance to the next tab. So this is module B. This is that measure of indirect exposure, which for now is just sea level rise, as Lindsay pointed out. Most of the remaining tabs have this format where there's what we call factors, so kind of a variable. A factor with this question mark, I'll show you what that does in a second, along with these radial buttons that give you an option for how to evaluate the relative change of that, in this case, sea level rise. So the default here is unknown. And so you need to select one. And then when you hover over this question mark here, up pops a window with the definitions that we've drawn directly from the guidance document with a definition of what this factor is. So in this case, defining what sea level rise means. And then perhaps just as importantly, how we define thresholds for each vulnerability response category. So in this case, in my example, I'm looking at coastal streams with beaver dams. It's possible sea level rise could influence that, but I'm going to go ahead and say it's probably less than 10% of the range I've identified. So that would, in this case, calculate as or qualify as a neutral vulnerability. And so now I'm going to switch to neutral vulnerability. One other thing to note before we move on to the next one is that modules A and B are required in order to get a vulnerability score in the end. These next 7 modules, module C through I, all relate to the adaptive capacity work that Lindsay touched on earlier. Those require that you answer at least 6 of those 7 with one factor evaluation. And so by factor, we just mean one of these variables with responses. For the sake of time, I'm going to kind of skip over them and give them short shrift. But I do want to point out a couple of things. So in this case, module C, distribution, you can see now there's several factors to evaluate. I've already evaluated them very crudely in this case. But you should also note, one, these question marks are available to define each factor. And then not every factor has the same response category. So in this case, extent of occurrence, moderate is not actually an option. That's okay. You answered just the ones that are available. I'll move on to the next one now, module D. I'll point out here, also important to scroll down because some of these have numerous factors that you need to evaluate that are not necessarily available at that first go. Okay, I'm going to advance past these modules. Oh, I will point out here, because I have answered the sufficient number of adaptive capacity modules, I do get a running adaptive capacity score. That's 0 to 7. And with the way the algorithm works, a smaller number means more adaptive capacity. So through demography. Okay, so our next module that is comes after adaptive capacity is this threat multipliers. It's basically looking at things that increase vulnerability, even if they're not directly related to climate change. So things like, say, barriers to movement, either natural or human-generated barriers, would preclude movement to perhaps suitable conditions or places where conditions will be suitable into the future. These are all marked as unknown. This module requires that at least 3 out of these 5 be answered. So I'm going to go ahead and just do 2 so that we can kind of get a sense for what that looks like when we don't meet the minimum requirements. Next module, this is that module K, documented or modeled responses. This is entirely optional, but it does give you an opportunity to bring in other lines of evidence, basically other work that bears on the vulnerability assessment that you're conducting. So things like other documented responses to climate change or modeling work that is relevant to your species and population. Okay, so that's the last of the assessment modules. I ran through those pretty quickly. Now this is the second to last tab, this module summary. This just gives you a running total of the % complete for each of the modules for the assessment. And so you can see some are completed at 100%, some at none. And then this last tab here is the scoring. And before I interpret the scores, I just want to point out this little error has popped up for module J, this threat multipliers. And that goes back to because we did not answer a sufficient number of factors. And so I'm going to increase that. Now I've answered at least 3. And if we go back to the scoring tab, that error message has gone away. Okay. And that error will pop up if any of the other requirements related to exposure or adaptive capacity are not met. So for the scoring, you essentially get 3 things that are important to look at. One is the overall qualitative assessment of adaptive capacity. And in this case, for these species, based on what I have put in so far, it is categorized as high. So high adaptive capacity. And then you get exposure results for each of the 2 emission scenarios. So this high emission scenario, RCP 8.5, gives you an exposure estimate, again, categorical, that is high for that geography that I chose, but that the overall vulnerability is considered less vulnerable. So that's our lowest category, because even though it's a high exposure, it's balanced out by high adaptive capacity and the algorithm. And then you get similar results here in the RCP 4.5 scenario. So I'll just close out here. That is those are the major tabs. As I said earlier, it is important to save. When you do save, you're given 2 options. One is to overwrite. So this is just kind of like your normal save button on a Microsoft product, or you can save as a new assessment altogether. It's up to you. The other thing is, and this is one of the things we're real excited about, is that you also do have the option to share either with collaborators or partners by entering in their email to this field here. Just note that anybody that tries to look at the assessment will be required to have an account with the CCVI online tool. And with that, I think I'll stop and open it up to any questions if there are.
Thanks, John. Yeah, great overview. So while you were describing that, a couple of questions came in, although Lindsay answered them all.
So Megan asked, how do some of these factors affect plants or sessile species? And on the sort of beginning page, you have the option to select the kingdom, so plant or animal. And when you do that, it will set which factors are provided. So in this case, for example, John selected animals. And so if you were to go over to the life history module H, you'd see that hopefully the mating system factor will specify criteria for animals and parity as well. And if you were to have selected plants, then the plant-specific criteria would show alternatively. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you, Lindsay. And more questions are coming in. Harriet asks, if you evaluate the exposure from two separate populations, does it just calculate one exposure score averaged across the entire geographic domain?
So if I understand that correctly, if you have two different spatial extents that represent different populations and you click calculate, yes, you will get an average from those two. If that's the question.
Yes, I think that's correct. If you're interested in, you can assess those two populations separately. You just have to make different assessments for each one. Going quickly here, an anonymous attendee writes, I'm curious about why, for exposure, MACA downscale data in RCP scenarios.
Yeah, so the decision there, I will preface this by saying that for climatic water deficit and average temperature, because these are averaged over a 30-year time period and annually, I would not guess that there would be much of a difference between the MACA data and the LOCA data. We went with the MACA downscale data because for future iterations, we were hoping to include things like extreme rainfall events in there. For this CMAP, there's some evidence that the MACA downscale does a somewhat of a better job, but again, those are both great data sets. For how we're using them, I would guess that they would put out pretty similar output. We met with the USGS CAS climate scenario group, and they said that this was an approach that they thought would work well for this. But again, the LOCA, we did look at the NCA. The time periods are not exactly the same as the time periods that we were using, so we just wanted things to be consistent.
All right. Should we just take a quick look then at the Excel version? Keep your questions coming in. So first, let's just look at our website. So you just can go to www.natureserve.org/CCVI. You actually don't need the dash species. There's a redirect there. So that gets you to the page where we have all the information. Alternatively, if you want to go straight to the online tool, it's ccvi.natureserve.org. So that's a subtle difference there. So here's all this information about the tool. You can see you can go straight to the CCVI online thing or the Excel workbook there. Scroll down, here's more general information about it. Here's a link to download the workbook, the Excel version. And you might want to download the climate exposure data for that if you want to do it yourself, kind of climate exposure. Here's the link to the guidelines we've talked about. That's where there's the detailed explanation of how to use the tool. The instructions that appear on those little pop-ups that John showed us should be word for word the same as what you read here in those overall guidelines. Here's another link to the online tool. And then down here, here's some of the previous releases, sort of for historical reasons, but here's a link to that current Canadian version. So that's the web page. When you download for the first time the workbook, you're going to get this message. I mean, so you click the link to download the Excel version. You have to fill out your name and stuff. And then you get a link, and then you can download it. And you're going to get this scary security risk, and that's because the workbook has macros. And Microsoft doesn't like you to use macros because it's a security risk. But trust me, these have been vetted. So as far as we know, they're safe. So if you click on this, learn more, you'll get to a website and tells you what you have to do. Basically, you have to go back into your directory and alter the properties of the file before you can open it and have access to the macros. So just wanted to give you a heads up there. And then once you have access to the macros, this is what the top of the workbook looks like for the people that have used it before. This should be starting to look familiar in kind of a so ugly it's cute kind of way. Although we do have these lovely new logos up there. So the same information John was talking about. There's a cool Excel tip here. If you do Control+, if you do Control and semicolon together, it automatically puts in today's date. Little Excel tip you learned today. Again, here's your notes. John was talking about that. So here's a big difference here. So this is where you enter the exposure data. So here on the Excel version, you have two choices. You can select the state, and it'll just use the general exposure value for the state. So here you just go through here. Like if I pick Oregon, it'll use the exact same values that you would get if you chose Oregon in the online version. Alternatively, you can leave this blank and hand write in here what the exposure value is for each of the two RCPs. So you can go into the online version, use that cool tool in module A that John was talking about us to any of the three methods there to get your values, and then you hand write them in here. Or you can download the exposure data yourself from the web page, use your own GIS, do it your own way. Or even, I mean, this is where you can use your own climate data. Someone was asking about cross-border analyses. You're going to have to use your own climate data there and do the scaling and all that kind of stuff to be able to get values for that. So that's a big difference. All of the factors are on this one tab here. It's called Form, and you'll see you just click on these little radio buttons. We have little indications here for what's required. Here's, everything in red here is about requirements. You scroll down. So here's one where there's a factor for animals, one for plants and fungi. You can enter, if you are working on an animal, I think this one was for a bumblebee, you can click, I think you can, oh, you can only click one across here. So you should be set there. Even if you could click there, it wouldn't, like I said, the algorithm won't take it into account. You're filling out all these various factors here. These are all the AC ones. Then we get to module J. These are the threat multipliers. This is where you needed to fill out at least 3 out of the 5 to get a score. That module K, totally optional. If you happen to have information from the literature or a range shift analysis, you can enter that here. And here's your data completeness tab. And you can see we have some red values here because module A, recall that I deleted the data there. So if we really want to get a score, we have to go back up there and pick a state. Done that. Let's see if this is working. Yeah, so now we have data for the 2 RCPs. Everything's there. We have all our minimum data. We can go to the next tab and see the results here. So here's a summary of the assessment information. Here's a general categorical description of how extreme the climate exposure was. So moderate for RCP 4.5, a little bit higher there for 8.5. A categorical description of the adaptive capacity of the species. This one has pretty high adaptive capacity. And the overall category, according to the two different RCPs, in this case, it came out the same. You can look at the summary of adaptive capacity. What percent of those factors were unknown here in gray? What gave it high adaptive capacity? So low vulnerability to climate change, and then how some of the other ones came out. Finally, we have this beautiful adaptive capacity wheel. You can look for patterns across there. So for like this species, you can see like the blue means high adaptive capacity. So the bee I looked at has high adaptive capacity for these factors, but maybe a little bit lower for abiotic niche or life history. Here's a summary of the data for the two different RCPs, overall categories, some numerical values there. Now, you're going to want to do more than one species. So how do you do that? When you've finished with one, you just hit this copy data to results table. It takes you to this third tab, the results table, and it just pasted all those data into this spreadsheet, and it goes, it's all the different categories here, all the way over. How you scored it, and then even at the end, it puts in the date that you pasted it, so it helps you keep track if you're doing it multiple times. Now, let's say you finished an assessment and your buddy comes up and says, oh, no, you screwed up, or we got new information for demography or something, we need to change what you did. So you can just, you put your cursor in the row of the one you want to edit, click on this thing, and it asks, okay, what it's going to do is paste it all back into that form tab, and it asks, okay, are you sure you want to erase everything that was there? You say yes, and then you're back there. Everything's pasted back in. You can go in and make whatever change you want. Say you wanted to change that, anything else. You can then copy it again. And then now it's been copied into a new row down here. And you can, if you like want to get rid of this, you're worried about getting confusing, you just highlight the row and you can just delete it like that. So those are some of the different ways you can use the Excel version. Like there's advantages and disadvantages of the two versions. Like for the online version right now, there's no sort of results table to look at a whole bunch of assessments. You can just see the ones that you've done. You have to kind of look at them one at a time. But it's, of course, clunky to kind of collaborate with the Excel workbook. There's no way to just share this with a colleague across the country or across the state. You have to email the whole workbook. So that remains just as clunky as ever. So I'll stop there and see if there's any more questions then about this, or maybe they've been coming in, I don't know. Lindsay, where are we?
Yes, I've been answering them as we go. I think there was a couple of questions that, you know, maybe others would be interested in that I answered in the chat. Megan asked if we have time, could we explain how to use the TNC Resilient Lands? I think it's the Resilient Lands tool that we reference in Module J, those threat multipliers. I personally don't have a ton of experience with that tool. I've played around with it a little bit. I think the idea there is to, you know, if you're trying to get at more of a quantification of, in this case, you know, sort of barriers to movement and connectivity, that is one way to go about it. But I don't know that, I won't speak for others, but I don't personally have a pre-practiced tutorial for using that. I apologize.
Yeah, I think the same for the rest of it. It's been a while for me.
Yeah, I mean, like most of these factors, the goal is to accommodate both quantitative and qualitative information in evaluating them. So, it could be your expert best estimate. It could come from actual numbers from, peer-reviewed journals. It could be anecdotal. I mean, and that leads into wanting to improve the quantification of certainty and your strength of evidence, which we're pursuing as well. But we did our best to make sure that all those lines of input could be accommodated.
And as you're thinking about other questions, just another tip here is that if you're just getting started on this, it really helps to have a colleague, and if you independently assess the same species and then compare your notes and see where you scored them differently and try to figure out why and come to a consensus on why you did it differently. This is especially important when there's teams of people doing assessments, like a large number of assessments for a state. You want to kind of calibrate yourselves first, make sure you're following the same rules of thumb, the same conventions, scoring things the same way. So that gives a little more inter-assessor consistency for your overall project. I think another question did come in, if someone wants to read that.
Megan also asked if all the requirements for data required to get an assessment score are specified in the guidelines, and the answer to that is yes. Kind of all those details are clarified in the guidelines, so it'd certainly go there for details.
Yeah, I think Wendy's comment that she just provided is really worth reading through, because you sort of have two options. You can, say you have a team of 3 doing the same species and the same geography, like you could each do your own assessment. And in some ways, that's probably a better way to be transparent about where those discrepancies come up. And then many times they're relevant, right? And then the other option is to all work on the same assessment, and you have to be extremely careful of overriding others, inputs. So it kind of depends on, I guess, how much transparency and nuance you want to introduce in for that species and that geography. We are working so that there hopefully will be an option to sort of publicly share your assessment so that it is searchable by others. And so, if you wanted to see all the assessments that have been done for, the American porcupine, for example, you could query that species and hopefully see all of the assessments for different geographies. So I could see a real benefit from having folks do independent assessments from that perspective, because then you could go in sort of retrospectively and evaluate those differences and determine where those differences are relevant and maybe just sort of user error.
I will also piggyback off of that and say that we are really interested in feedback related to when you're consistently getting different answers, or if there's specific traits that are coming up as disagreements, both from a documentation standpoint of could we be clearer, or are there certain traits that are really hard to reconcile, and the literature might be really disparate on what those are, especially for certain types of taxa. So from improving the tool, but then also identifying knowledge gaps in the future, we're really interested in that kind of feedback. So whether it's formally collected or more anecdotal, please, we would love any of that information.
And in fact, we got an email last week from an early adopter whose eagle eyes pointed out 2 typos in the guidelines document. So we
welcome
love
those for sure.
I mean, as we say at NatureServe, error detected, error corrected.
There you go.
We'll be fixing that soon. And I guess with that, we'll wrap it up. And thank you again. And have lots and lots of fun with the CCVI, and stay in touch if you have questions or comments or suggestions.